welcome to our Preparing for the Leap for Science Assessment webinar. My name is Brendan Finch. So I taught middle and high school science in Los Angeles for 7 years. I left the class, so I taught for LUSD and some charter networks in the LA area as well. I left the classroom to build rocketlit.com. So that was our first sort of like product and website. I had a lot of really smart kiddos that were just at really low reading levels, and they needed practice reading in science and accessing materials independently. So that's how I left the classroom. It's been almost a decade now. And we started working on Inner Orbit about 5 years ago. So that's our three-dimensional assessment platform. We do support a bunch of folks in Louisiana with Rocketlit or with Inner Orbit. I wrote a lot of the assessments on the site initially, and now we have much better content on the site. We're on our 4th iteration for many of our assessments, and we are starting to build out some new materials, which we'll call more flexible materials. So think like do nows and discussion questions that are based around a phenomena rather than the formal assessments that we have on the site now. So I'm really excited to share those with you, and I'll give a couple of little samples today so that y'all can see what I've been cooking up in the lab. But that's what I do. So I speak to a lot of teachers and admin to better support y'all. So with that introduction out of the way, let's dive into our webinar for today. So we're here to analyze some release test items and dive into some strategies and resources to build scaffolding practice for the LEAP and uncover three-dimensional actionable data. That's what we really want to do. We're going to be here for about 45 minutes, and we're going to start out with some middle school test item analyses. We'll talk about three-dimensional standards, always important to talk about that, and then talk about how we might scaffold up to those standards. We'll look at that item, we'll look at some Inner Orbits items that might lead up to those questions, and then we're going to get into using phenomena for test prep. So we have been working with a lot of schools and districts that are preparing for statewide assessment measures that are three-dimensional, and I want to present some opportunities for you to use phenomena throughout a unit rather than just preparing for the test. Maybe ways you can use phenomena throughout an entire unit. Some structures that we see some of our partners use, which are these daily do nows, which are just kind of like little let's dip our toe into increasing in rigor phenomena and assessment items. And then also we have these things called SEB practice problems, which are pretty neat, and I'll show you them in a little bit. But it's ways for us to sort of try out and practice our SEP work, but without content, which is controversial, but I'll show it to you and you can make your own decision. In case you don't know what Inner Orbit is, it's a fairly simple platform. So what we do are we find phenomena for students to take what they learned in class and apply that learning towards something novel and specific. And that's real things that happen in the real world and allowing students to make sense of new things. And within each of those phenomena, you're going to find a whole bunch of questions. The questions are all tagged to really discrete parts of the standards. So some questions will be tied to an SEP, some to a cross-cutting concept, some to just a DCI, and some will have all three of those things woven together. And as teachers or districts build assessments and then use those and have students take those assessments, we generate really detailed reports. And so you can take a look at what aspects of the SEP we're looking at developing using models here. Students were demonstrated proficiency on in grades 3-5 or in grades 6-8. And so you can dive into really specific pieces of the standards and say, all right, so students were able to use a model to test cause and effect relationships, concerning the functioning of a system, but they really struggled with developing a model to describe unobservable mechanisms. So things that are too fast or too slow or too great or too small of a scale for us to meaningfully observe in our existence or with our senses. And so those are things that are really difficult to model, and they're extremely abstract. So we want to identify those places and then help students to scaffold up to those things. And that's kind of the goal, is just generating that or illuminating that meaningful data so that you can dive into it with your students. Okay, so to start off, we always want to make sure that we are focusing on an actual task that your students need to drive towards. And here we are going to look at this task for the LEAP, which is centered on this standard. And so this is MS LS44. Students have to construct an explanation based on evidence that describes how genetic variations of traits in a population increase some individual's probability of surviving and reproducing in a specific environment. There are 3 dimensions to the standard: the SEP, constructing explanations. Students have to understand the DCI, which is natural selection, and then finally the cross-cutting concept of cause and effect, and that some things may have multiple causes, but that we can use cause and effect relationships to describe outcomes. And so within this, we're going to look at two different questions and consider the differences between these questions. And so the first question is, we'll call this like an old school question. So which statement about natural selection is true? And we want students to understand that helpful traits or successful traits, for reproduction specifically, can become more common in a population over time. So that is question number one. That's a true statement. And then question number two was pulled directly from the LEAP practice test. And so there is a large population of comb jellies was found living in an area with a large food source. After a long period of overfishing, the food source in the area significantly decreased. Scientists want to build a model to describe how the change in the availability of food may affect different types of comb jellies in the population. And so students have to drag and drop these different elements of these things in order to show what's happening to this population of comb jellies over the course of multiple generations. So the question I want you to ponder and then answer in the chat is, what is the difference between these two questions? And also, why is that difference important? If we're looking at what we want students and ourselves as educators to do, what's the difference between these questions and why is that important? So I'll give you a minute in the chat to respond. If you're watching this as a recording, feel free to write some comments on the video. So this first question is, we call this you repeating or representing a piece of knowledge that students have discussed before. And so this is not applying their knowledge through novel phenomena. Sometimes we'll see questions like this, and they actually have complex graphs. They'll have images, they'll have like a whole, like long narrative about like the comb jellies or something. And then this is what the question will be for students. And I just want to call out that sometimes we'll see, so a question like this that looks like a sense-making question, it looks complex, but it's actually very simple. So be on the lookout for if there are ways that you see questions and students can cover up the text of the graphs or the phenomena or whatever it is and still answer that question, because that could be a representation question or one of these really simple knowledge-only questions, recall questions, as I saw in the chat, in disguise as a sense-making question. And that doesn't serve our students, and it actually is difficult for us as educators because it's not measuring what we want to measure, which is that transferability. So that second question, it's taking something novel and really specific. So these comb jellies, maybe students have knowledge of this, but given what we're looking for them to do and drag and dropping these things in there, they need to use that SEP of constructing explanations. So their understanding of natural selection through the lens of building this explanation of what happens and how that leads together through the lens of cause and effect. So this is a three-dimensional performance, and it's, this is a multiple choice question. However, this is leveraging all three dimensions to grapple with this novel situation. And so these are the types of phenomenal sense-making questions that we want to build students up to. So the question is, how do we get students up to this point? Well, before we answer that question, I want to walk back and make sure that we're crystal clear on what three-dimensional standards are. This is really, really important because if we know what our objective is and how they wrote these questions, then we can look at questions like this and have objectives for students, and we can build our instruction to lead up to that point, to prepare students for these rigorous performances and life in general. So again, the standard that we're looking at is MS-LS44, where students have to construct an explanation based on evidence that describes how genetic variations in traits in a population increase some individual's probability of surviving and reproducing in a specific environment. That's called the performance expectation up top, and it bakes in these three dimensions right there. And so those three-dimensional standards we'll see as characterized as the practices, the content, and the cross-cutting concepts. So the practices and each of these come together for students to do these really complex tests and make sense of the world. And so they're very deliberately pulled together so that natural selection is what students know. So in order for you to be able to approach a question like this, you need to understand that there are traits that lead to success, and that those traits are often passed on, and that's a cornerstone of natural selection. In addition, that students need to be able to construct an explanation. That explanation be qualitative or quantitative, that shows relationships between variables to describe phenomena. So we need to show how each of those stages is related to each other, and we need to do that through the lens of cause and effects. The cross-cutting concepts, I think, are one of the more interesting parts of these standards, where students look through lenses. So how does cause lead to effect here? And how might probability, in even a qualitative way, lead to that happening? Natural selection is all just, increase in probability. It's not it's not going to definitely lead to these changes. And so cause and effect or scale, proportion, quantity, or system and system models are all just different ways that students can look at phenomena through this really discrete lens and provide some analysis. And they're so accessible to students. We had an interview and a webinar with another district leader who talked about one of her physics teachers talking about waffle makers for stability and change. And this teacher used waffle makers as a way to talk to students about things that make a system remain stable and points where they reach instability and they're no longer able to remain stable. And so waffle maker, I think, is a really interesting example because, if you don't plug it in for long enough, or you don't like coat the inside of it with something that's non-stick, then your waffle is going to get ripped apart, or it's not going to get baked all the way. If you put too much batter in there, then it's like a total disaster, and the system reaches instability. But if everything is maintained at the exact right level, then it's stable, and you get tasty, delicious waffles out of that thing. And there's lots of different factors that contribute towards that stability. So it's a really complex system that can be stable or can become unstable. So I thought it was a really interesting way to look at something like stability and change through the lens of something that's accessible to students. This particular teacher students said, Mister, why did you use the concept of waffle maker? You should have said panini maker, which I guess was more popular for them. I don't know. I'm more familiar with waffle makers than panini makers. Anyways, so with this standard and with what we're looking at, students are constructing explanations, they're using natural selection, they're thinking about cause and effect, and all of those things lead into questions like this. And that's the performances that we need to prepare students for. So these phenomenal performances using novel phenomena and using these three-dimensional things. And so to even further talk about these two terms, sense-making and representation, because I want to make sure that these are discrete in your mind before we go into how we're going to scaffold students up. So representation is communicating ideas students have previously learned. So if I teach a lesson about finches and their beaks, and then in the Galapagos finches and like that type of natural selection that occurred where different beaks are used in different, or best suited for different food sources, and the prevalence of those types of beaks in those areas where that food source is available. That's what we saw over time. And if we did an exit slip on that same phenomena, that would be communicating idea that we previously learned. Even if it was a rigorous task, it's still just communicating. It's great for formative assessments. If we're building towards a novel phenomena assessment or the LEAP assessment, it's important for students to show that they know things. However, beyond that learning development, it's insufficient evidence of proficiency. So if I talk to you about the finches and their beaks, and then I give you an assessment on the finches and their beaks, this is not showing how they can make sense of something new. This is showing that they understood the thing you talked about in class, which won't serve them on the LEAP. And frankly, I think it's a disservice to them in terms of developing future scientists. Instead, what we are looking for students to build towards is sense making, and that is explaining why or how to make sense of a novel phenomena. This is great for summative assessment. So after students have gone through some instructional practices to say, hey, now look at this new thing that you've never seen before. This is a demonstration of their mastery of the standard, of a true understanding of what they need to do. And it's the goal of the NGSS. And so we want students to take their understanding and apply it to something new. So I guess the question now is, how do we scaffold them up to this? So how can we get them from understanding things to this rigorous three-dimensional performance? So I want to explain this three-dimensional performance a little bit more as well. And this is an end goal. So you can't give students, a novel phenomena at the very, very beginning of a lesson on natural selection and expect them to be able to explain it. We need them, in order to do that, to understand that knowledge, to understand how to apply the cross-cutting concept, cause and effect in this case, and the SEP, which is constructing explanations, to explain why or how something is happening. And so how might we scaffold them up to this point? Well, one of the things we can do is identify the invisible steps that we're asking students to take. So where are they using different parts of the standard, different parts of the knowledge and skills or these lenses? And then we can also gather data on each of those steps to best support kiddos. So to bring them from, again, this DCI only understanding, I know what natural selection is, to that three-dimensional sense making. I can now take all of those concepts and apply them to something novel. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at this same standard, so MS LS44, and we're going to look at that through the lens of a phenomena. And that phenomena, so this is one of the phenomena from the InOrbit website. We have around 8,000 of these phenomena, and we're writing more and more all the time. This is, why do these moths morph? And so we're looking at the peppered moth. This is a super familiar phenomena. And what's really, really interesting is that these changes in peppered moths occurred during, the Industrial Revolution. And one of the reasons for that are that we think is that, there were these factories just like pumping out coal, and it literally changed the color of the trees. And so moths that had predominantly been lighter in color were now at an evolutionary disadvantage. They were there were more predators that were able to see them easier. And so the moths that were this darker variation were able to actually blend in more with the soot-covered trees. And so those populations sort of like swapped in, how often we would see them. And now that things are cleaning up, we're seeing the opposite switch. So instead of there being a, prevalence of these darker moths on soot-covered trees, there are more regulations, things are cleaner, and we're actually seeing prevalence of the lighter colored moths in some places where there are lighter colored trees. And so this is one of the phenomena that we have on our website that we give students to say, can we prepare for that comb jelly assessment is really the goal. And so we like to start out, or we like to end with questions that are what we call summative questions or three-dimensional questions. We label these as sense-making questions. And so in this case, students need to use their knowledge of natural selection, as well as evidence from figures 1 and 2. So there's two different models that we give them, or two different data sets, to construct a scientific explanation about why the peppered moth population has changed so drastically during different times in history. Be sure to include a discussion of the factors or variables that cause the change, that's the cause and effect part, and how they impacted the population. That is the constructing explanations and the natural selection part. So this is what we call a sense-making question. It's pulling together all three of these things. And so this goes beyond the level of rigor of that LEAP question. And that's really important, because if we could hold students to this level of rigor, then they're going to hit this one, at a much greater rate if they're prepared for something that's much, much more rigorous. And so in order to get them from, knowing things like which of these, statements is true about natural selection to making sense of a new phenomena, we can ask them two-dimensional questions. And so those can come through the lens of the DCI and the cross-cutting concept. So let's ask about how they can use their knowledge of natural selection through cause and effect relationships. And then we can also ask them questions to construct explanations, to revise explanations, to say, is this correct? So and so made these different claims. Is this an evaluation of those things? We can ask them to do two-dimensional performances without using cause and effect necessarily. And then we can ask them those three-dimensional questions later on to say, all right, now can you apply everything you know through the lens of that that three-dimensional performance, making sense of something new. And so I'm going to walk you through the scaffold that we use on Inner Orbit, and this is a way for you to sort of frame maybe the progress that your students are making, and a way for you to scaffold them up in preparation for the LEAP, and frankly for just science and life in general. So the first types of questions we write are called core content questions. And so these are simple questions that just ask about the DCI. So all we're doing is saying, do you know what natural selection is? That's it. These questions will look like this. So organisms with traits that are not fit for their mind are less likely to, and we want them to understand that they're less likely to survive and reproduce. And so that's important. If students know that, then we can grow in rigor from there. So this deliberately leaves out the cross-cutting concept in the SCP. We're able to gather data on whether they know the things, and then we can see if they can make sense of phenomena with them. But before they make sense of phenomena fully, we can ask them two-dimensional questions about the DCI and the SCP. So we can say, consider the moths in figure 1 and the trees they're currently resting on. Which moth would likely be eaten first? So we want them to be able to construct a representation showing the relationships between these variables, namely the tree and the moth and those colors, thinking about natural selection as well, and answer that question. This is looking at just constructing explanations, natural selection, and we're not yet getting into just cause and effect directly. And so then we can ask additional questions that hit the two dimensions, the DCI and the cross-cutting concept, the other two dimensions. And we say, suppose a logging company started cutting down trees in the forest. Which moths would most likely be affected? So we're looking at cause and effect. So this cutting down of trees to the effect. And we want students to understand that both the light and the dark colored moths would be affected because they both use the trees to camouflage from predators. So if they just, were cutting down trees willy-nilly, everyone would be impacted by that. This is the cause and effect. So we're not necessarily constructing any explanations. We're not showing relationships between lots of different parts in the system. We're just looking at cause and effect. And then finally, we can ask questions that are three-dimensional, that are multiple choice. And so this is close to the comb jelly question. We can say, refer to figure 2. If a new type of tree, a dark tree, started to grow in the forest, how would you expect this to affect the number of light and dark moths? And so we want students to understand cause and effect. We want them to understand natural selection. We want them to be able to choose this explanation to show the relationships between all of these different factors through the lenses of the other dimensions. And so this is an example of a three-dimensional multiple choice question. And we have lots of these for every single standard. So In this way, you can scaffold students up from asking about their knowledge, so the core content, and then we can, increase the rigor by applying that through the lens of an SEP or through the lens of a cross-cutting concept. And then finally, we can ask rigorous three-dimensional questions. They can be multiple choice questions. They can be free response questions. Students can draw models, or we can give them, examples of here's so-and-so makes this claim, evaluate their claim, or so-and-so builds this model. What would you want to change the model to make it more accurate? So sense-making questions can involve a lot of like, this is close, but not quite. And it's a good way to see, okay, so can students make progress on these things? And so on Inner Orbit, if you go onto our website, so you'll find lots and lots of phenomena for you to pull from. Each of those phenomena are going to have a whole bunch of different question types. And all the question types will have specific parts of the standard, like just the DCI, or the cross-cutting concept in the DCI, or the SCP in the DCI. So you can pull from these, or three-dimensional questions. You can pull questions to build an assessment. And then the reports on our site are really, really, really meant to say, okay, now, if we asked questions about just the DCI, so where are students at with respect to that DCI at the 6-8 grade level band? And maybe we can ask questions about the 3-5 grade level band and say, okay, looks like they struggled with the idea that there are structures that have functions. And so if that's the case, then we can go up to 6-8 and say, well, they also struggle with the idea that there are structures in cells that have functions, and with the idea that there are these levels of organization, again, these smaller structures that work in concert through these different units, and that's how organisms are built through these levels of organization that work together. So they struggle with those things. So maybe we need to talk a little bit more about the fact that like there's differentiation in and specific function at different levels of an organism or of a system, and that might solve that problem. In addition, when we look at things like SEPs, we can look at the SCP of planning, care, and investigations and see specific skills from an entire grade level band like 6-8 and say, all right, so these kiddos, we haven't gathered data on their ability to plan investigations or identify variables. We haven't gathered any information about their ability to evaluate or revise experimental designs. However, we know that they struggled the most with collecting data to serve as evidence to answer scientific questions, kind of like a CER statement at the end of a lab. You can imagine a LEAP question where we have an investigation that so-and-so did and the data that was collected from that, and then students have to answer questions about that. So that's what this part of the standard is getting at. So all of this is intended to illuminate and show teachers and students sort of like where they need to do more work or where they can elaborate, and we can have other phenomena and like do more complex tasks because we're there for it and we're ready. So all of these aspects of the reports are generated by those questions that have a really, really precise tagging. So we're constantly building more questions, and we're really, really excited to share this with you. But on that note, let's dive into how we might be able to use these phenomena and these items for test prep. So really specifically, again, we're going to dive into the same standard. I'm going to keep this thread running through the entire thing. So we're looking at MS-LS44, which is construct an explanation based on evidence that describes how genetic variations of traits in a population increase some individuals' probability of surviving and reproducing in a specific environment. So students have to use the SEP, constructing explanations. They have to use the DCI of natural selection and the cross-cutting concept of cause and effect. And all of those things need to come together. So we talked about using phenomena for an assessment, but how can we use phenomena throughout the course of a unit? And so I want to think about practice first. And so we're going to look at a little roadmap of how we can use in-orbit's phenomena throughout the course of a unit. And these are all phenomena from our website that you can use in different contexts to sort of prep students for maybe that final performance, that big for response question that we looked at, or the LEAP test, if you will. So the first is we can say, how have pupfish adapted over time? And so this phenomena is all about how we can see a variation of traits in the desert pupfish between these different pools within a small area of the desert. So there's all these tiny pools, and this pupfish has really been distributed in these tiny pools that somehow stay, filled with water in the desert. And there are different traits in each of these pools. It's not a wide area, but the same species exist with different traits across these pools, which is super, super interesting. And so here we could ask students questions about the cross-cutting concepts, like discussion questions about the SEPs. The whole class can answer all of these things together. And it can provide an opportunity in a really low stakes way for students to just kind of like see a phenomena and touch on it at the very beginning of a unit. And then maybe in the middle of the unit, we can ask we can have a, printed and scaffolded group phenomena exploration. So we can print out a phenomena and some questions and ask students to explore them together. And so here, maybe we're looking at snail kites and limpkins. and how they add different environmental pressures on snails in Costa Rica. And we actually have data sets from research studies that show these relationships. It's really, really interesting. And so students look at, how these different pressures are applied in order to organisms to change what the successful traits look like. And so depending on the predator that you have available in your environment, what success means for you is going to be different. And so in this way, students can sit down, we can print out, a group of questions and a phenomena and have students in groups work together to answer rigorous questions about the DCIs, the SCPs, the cross-cutting concepts. And the teacher can also provide some scaffolding support. So, you're walking around, you can prompt students, you can give them some context. You say, remember that other thing we talked about, those like beaks or the pupfish, how is this similar to that? And in this way, we can sort of scaffold them up to the final part of the unit where we want students to now take their understanding and answer questions on a rigorous individual assessment. So here we can look at the Galapagos finches and how beak shape will change, based on the available food. So you're more successful, you can get the food that you need to live long enough to reproduce. You're gonna survive. You're gonna do better. And so in this part of the unit, we want to remove scaffolds. We want students to independently make sense of this novel phenomena. We need rigorous questions, and you can scaffold those questions, but the final questions that students need to be doing they need to be rigorous. They need to meet the level or exceed the level of the leap so that students are prepared for that final assessment. Teachers can obviously still provide scaffolding, but removing those scaffolds is incredibly important at this point because we want students to understand what the goal is. So what is the final product that we want you to be able to do with all the knowledge we've been working on? So at this point, throughout the course of this unit, we've looked at 4 different phenomena. So we have our super formal assessment, and then we have these pupfish at the beginning. We looked at the snail snackers, and then also this beak and the beak shape and the impact that has on populations. But what if our students aren't there yet? And so what if we need to go back? We need to look at from that middle school performance expectation back to a third grade performance expectation. We want to evaluate that prior knowledge and give low stakes practice. So in this way, we can ask questions like, use evidence to construct an explanation. We can go back to a third grade standard. This is one of the standards that articulates up into this middle school life science standard. Use evidence to construct an explanation for how the variations in characteristics among individuals of the same species may not provide advantages in surviving, or may provide advantages in surviving, finding mates, and reproducing. So we can go back from that middle school standard to the third grade standard that precedes it, and we can ask them questions using phenomena from there. So we can look at this, why does this caterpillar look like a snake? And we can ask students to sort of discuss, like some organisms that have evolved to look like different animals and confuse predators. And that can lead them to be pretty successful because that looks like much more intimidating than like a, tiny little caterpillar. And we'd also go back to, these are all phenomena, just to be clear, from the InOrbit website. Why do peacocks have so many eyes? And looking at, how the colorful tails on male peacocks help them to attract the attention of potential mates. And these are all just different ways that we can use these phenomena for test prep and allow, students to practice. And that practice is what is going to make things perfect. So we don't want to use phenomena just right before the leap. If that's where you're at and you got to do that, then please do that. But you can use them throughout a unit to prepare for the state test. And using different phenomena throughout a unit is going to give students more opportunities for you to model the process of sense making, or for students to model it with each other and to practice that transferring knowledge from the things we learned in class to this novel phenomena. And if this is what your students need, and if it's helpful, and honestly, I think the more phenomena that you give students, the better and more relevant your science class is going to be. But going back to a prior grade level is a great way to provide, additional sense-making opportunities and lower the stakes to see if there's some gaps in knowledge or skills that students have. So if they have trouble understanding the models or the data sets from elementary school, those 8th grade items are going to be a real struggle. So we want to make sure that we can scaffold them up to that point. We also have another structure that we use called daily do now. So let's just say you want to just sort of like boop, a phenomena on the nose every single time at the beginning of your class. So these are quick daily activities to sort of review prior standards and or gain experience with novel phenomena. So if your students freak out when they see a novel phenomena, what the goal is here is that we're going to build in rigor over time. So you can build an assessment, and on Monday, for our do now or at the introduction of this, we're just going to look at the phenomena. We're going to annotate the phenomena. I might, as a teacher, walk through it with students, say, oh, this data set, here's what the title of the graph says. Here's the trend line I see. What do we think this means without even reading anything about it? And we can dig into that. Then on Tuesday, we might ask some knowledge-only questions. On Wednesday, we can ask some questions about the content and the cross-cutting concepts. On Thursday, ask questions about the content, the DCIs, and the practices or the SCPs. And finally, on Friday, culminate with a sense-making question. It can be free response or a multiple-choice question. And we just kind of want to feed, slowly build up to those rigorous performances. And if we're not ready, or we're going to go a little bit deeper after those daily do nows, we can dive into these things that are phenomena transfer stations. This is actually an idea that came from one of our partners in Maryland, who told us that they were going on our site and they were finding a bunch of phenomena for a standard, and they were printing out 3 to 5 different assessments, so a phenomena and a bunch of questions, and they would set them on different tables, and the kids throughout the day would move from one table to another in groups, and they'd answer questions about these different phenomena. And so all the phenomena that we just used as our examples in here from inner orbit, they would print all those out and have 4 stations for kiddos to go through. And they're going to see the same ideas, but through the lens of different scenarios. This is really going to help with them, like sparking their curiosity and help them make connections between. So it's not just that like the finches and the beaks and the food, but it's the caterpillars, it's the pupfish, there's lots of different ways that we see that traits can become, be a determining factor in whether something's going to be successful, and thus whether those genes or those traits will be passed on. We can always ask students, scaffolded like 2-dimensional questions, and then we can have rigorous questions in here, and we can have them continuously go through to different stations to see lots of these different questions. Some considerations about this are that, assigning roles to groups is really helpful. So we work with adults, and even having a group of adults sit down, like we all want to get stuff done, but having a role and saying like, you're the timer, you're the writer, you're the fact checker is going to help us to, promote that productive conversation within each of those groups. So maybe they can swap roles as they go from station to station. This is a really good thing to do, at the middle or the end of a unit. So after students have some knowledge, because they're going to be walking around and applying that knowledge through the lens of several different things. And then have a whole class debrief afterwards. This is meant as a formative structure. So at the end of going through these, you can have an answer sheet that you share with students. Students can like maybe correct each other's phenomena and questions, but the idea is to review this so that they understand it. And then if you're looking for other ways to practice, especially things like the science and user practices, we have these things on an orbit called the SCP practice problems. And so they're content agnostic, which is controversial through the lens of an NGSS purist, but they're questions that align to the K-12 progressions for an SCP in elementary, middle, and high school. And we have these really interesting and these relevant phenomena. But we were looking for ways to give students just practice on the skills. So if it's looking at causation versus correlation, or if we're looking at trends in linear and nonlinear trends in data, we can look at these different, phenomena and see if students can apply that without having the burden of them understanding that content. So if you go on the website, you'll find these SCP practice problems in the build tab. And so we recently just rewrote and wrote even more for middle school. So you're going to find, for constructing explanations and designing solutions, we can look at these bird houses and allowing us to use these bird houses and different bird foods and seeing different ways that we can analyze data and construct explanations using that. And constructing explanations and designing solutions also looks at maybe a more engineering challenge that involves, somebody's going to set up a zip line in their house and they live in this mansion. And so they're going to build this zip line, and we're going to look at, what material they used and how well they sort of like iterated upon them. And all these questions are only tied to an SCP. So you're going to see different elements of the SCP popping up on the side. And we have some teachers that use these as like do nows or warm ups, or as like a diagnostic at the beginning of the school year, at the beginning of a unit, or across multiple grade levels. So, if you're physics and chemistry and biology and earth science, you can use these SCP practice problems across your entire department at a high school or middle school or elementary school level. And everyone can give the same assessment and see how students are performing on these practice problems, which are really, really interesting. And so in this way, these problems help to build skill mastery and also target specific growth. So if there's an area where students need more support or where they're just rocking it, then you can be like, all right, let's push this even further and see how far you can take it and look at these novel scenarios as different ways for you to apply your understanding. We're also building out these sort of practice sets of phenomena. These are on Google Slides right now, but at some point they won't be. They'll be on the site in a much more formal way. But we're trying to find ways for students to have informal practice at sense making. And so we're building these out in the background right now. They're not published on the site, but someday soon they will be. And so we'll maybe ask students to, look at how different spheres interact in this close call. So this is a fifth grade standard, it's ESS 2.1. And so we might have them say, what spheres can you observe? And so if they articulate the spheres. And then maybe say, okay, now tell me how those spheres are interacting with each other. And we'll have a list of the spheres. And then build to, all right, now label those spheres on here. And once you've labeled, where the geo, bio, hydro, and atmosphere are, we can say, all right, now drag and drop arrows to show what parts of spheres are interacting with the other parts. And that's what this standard is all about, sphere interactions. And then finally use your model to explain how in this scenario, different spheres are interacting with each other. And we can slowly build up to this rigorous model and explanation of these sphere interactions. Or we can ask quick do now questions on hurricane paths and look at, so this is MS ESS 2.6, looking at weather patterns and the many different things that impact weather patterns. And so, this is a map of 150 years of hurricanes that start off the coast of Africa. What patterns do you see and where those hurricanes occur? It's really, really interesting to see that there's some, really, really clear patterns on here. And we might ask them to say, almost every hurricane moved from the left to right. What needs to be added to this model to explain why they move from left to right? So we slowly build up their ability to draw a model of this. And then maybe we'll say, how might the rotation of the Earth impact where hurricanes occur? And then finally, maybe we'll say, why is there a space in the middle where there aren't these large storms? Like, why do they occur just in these two different strips? And they go in these, very specific directions, patterns. Really, really interesting. So we're building some of these things out in addition to these SCP practice problems to give students more informal practice. And so more on that later on. If you're following us, you'll see some of these things pop up on the site someday soon. And with that, we're gonna wrap it up, y'all. Thank you so much for being here and for going through all of this with us. So we did a lot today. We went over a lot of different strategies. We went over some test items, scaffolding, and different ways that you might use phenomena throughout a unit to prepare for the test. So if you'd like to try InterOrbit out and you haven't done so yet, you can always find a time on our calendar. So I'm going to drop a link to that in the chat. We offer free pilots. So if you want to try InterOrbit out, you're welcome to do that and use it with students and teachers and do that thing. If you're like, I don't want to talk to that guy, I want to start a pilot on my own, you're welcome to do that. So that second link that I dropped in will allow you to do that, or you can go to InterOrbit and sign up for a trial account. Also follow us on social media if that's helpful. We, put out content every once in a while, and our YouTube channel, we're particularly active. We're going to see lots of different webinars and videos be uploaded. And so if you're into the YouTube as a way to learn new things, then you can do that. And maybe if you're like, I don't want to do any of those things, you can always send us an email at inquiries@interorbit.com, and we'd love to hear from you and be helpful however we can. But thanks y'all for being here. Thanks for growing your practice and for considering all of these things that we went over. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day.